Hi guys, I'm Woodcraft Hamster and welcome back to my Beginner's Guide to Wood Carving series. Now what I'd like to talk to you about today is care, maintenance and sharpening of your tools. It's a really important part of wood carving and I think something that often gets forgotten, especially with newcomers who maybe aren't quite aware of kind of the upkeep needed for certain types of carving tools, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now for the old hands here, you might be surprised to hear that I'm not going to focus too much on actual sharpening in terms of sharpening stones. There's a time and a place for them, but actually I don't think you need to do it as often as some people believe. And what I think I'll do, let me move the camera just a little bit closer in and I'll show you what it is I'm talking about. Right then guys, so this is a pretty broad selection of my maintenance equipment for my carving tools, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to start off by showing you the things that I use the least. That's not to say they don't have a place, but these are the sort of things you really don't need to rush out and buy. So starting from the top up here, this is a what's known as the Lansky sharpening system. It's a proprietary brand, there are others available on the market, but essentially you have got a little clamp. You may have seen this in another video. You clamp your knife in here, you then take these, which are the actual sharpening elements. They fit on these little rods. I won't bother putting it together, and essentially the rods go into these little holes. They're at predetermined angles, and then you run the sharpening stone up and down the blade, and that will sharpen at a particular angle. Now that works really well for knives with secondary bevels. You can do it with Scandi grinds. I find it doesn't work quite so well. This was just something I picked up at one point, and really just more for reference. Now next up we've got this, which is a diamond sharpening stone. It's in its own little box. It's got rubber feet to stop it from moving around too much, and what you've got are 4 different colour coded sharpening elements, going from sort of coarse to extra fine. These are really good for kind of proper tools, things like chisels and other sort of bladed tools that don't have too fine an edge on them, you know, or have more of an acute edge. I don't like using these on my knives because I tend to find the tips get caught in these little holes. But you know, at a push, these are cheap as chips. I think this one cost me about a £5, and they do work. This is just another example of a diamond sharpening stone. This is, you can see on the back, I put extra fine on there with a marker pen so I don't forget. And again, same sort of thing, it works better for knives because you don't have those little holes in there. And I think I got a set of 4 of these, again from coarse to extra fine, and again cost me about £10. So these are kind of like the cheaper end of the market, and anyone can go out and buy these. You know, they do work. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them. They're not my personal preference, and I'll move on to that in a second. So moving on to this, now I actually really like this. This is a little mahogany box that I made at the ripe old age of 15 in my school woodwork class. I routed out with a force and a bit the inside of the box and the corresponding side here, put a couple of wedges in, and this is an oil stone. I think it was made by Stanley. It's what's known as a combi stone, so there's one side is coarser than the other and I can just flip it round as I need. And I've been using this particular stone for years. It's starting to show a little bit of wear, but it's still perfectly good, and I tend to use this for some of my smaller knives. And you know, it just works. And these are again cheap as chips. You can pick up one of these stones for maybe £10, maybe a little bit less, and I think they're really good, and they're great for full-size knives. You know, you can start on one end and you can use the whole length of this stone, and it works really well. Another example of a sharpening stone, this is a particularly fine one. Again, I use this for my smaller knives, and this is really just, what do I say about this? I use this for kind of just touching up the blade once I've used it, because it's particularly fine. I mean, this probably goes slightly beyond the extra fine side of it. It's more for polishing really than it is for sharpening. But if I've been using one of my knives for a little while, you know, maybe half hour or an hour, I may, if I'm using a particularly hard wood, just give a few passes, maybe 5-10 strokes on each side of the blade, just to bring it back to full sharpness. And lastly, on the stone side, and I did say I was going to whiz through these, is this. Now you've got a little bench stand here which you can screw in, or sorry, you can twist these little knobs at the end and it will hold the stone in nice and tight. It's got rubber base so it doesn't move around too much. And this is a Japanese water stone. Anyone that watches people like Ray Mears will be familiar with these, and I really like them. And unlike things like oil stones, all you do with this is you stick it into a tub of water for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, let it saturate, take it back out, put it on your stand, and you're good to go. I use all of my Scandi knives on this, plus my axes as well. It's really good for both. And again, this is a combi stone. You've got a, this is maybe a medium grit. I think this might, no, in fact, actually I'll tell a lie. This is about 1,000 grit on here, which is what I will use if I'm just maintaining my knives and I don't need to do any heavy work on them. This is a 6,000 grit, which is really just there for final finishing and polishing. And this is known as a Nagura stone, and what you do, you soak this as well. You basically work the extra fine like this, you create a little bit of a slurry, and then you can get that on the end of your finger, being very careful, and you can just use the tip of your finger to polish the bevel of your knife. Now, as I say, all of these stones, I very rarely use them. And the reason for that is that I don't feel the need or the necessity to fully sharpen my knives on a regular basis. If I've been out for a weekend or a trip or something and I've been using my knives quite heavily, I'll probably do exactly that, and I'll start off with something like the 1,000 grit and I'll move on to the 6,000 later on. The only time I'd use a particularly coarse stone is if I've damaged the blade of my knife. If I've been carving and I've hit something hard that I wasn't expecting to, if I've been using my axe and there's been a bit of a stone or something that's chipped the edge of my knife, I'll then have to do a lot more work with a very coarse stone to begin with, and then you work through your grades getting progressively finer. That doesn't tend to happen very often. And I don't personally see the point of using coarse and medium stones on your knives regularly if they don't need them, because all you're doing when you sharpen your knives and your tools, you are removing material from the knife, and it just means that you're taking a little bit of life off of your knife. Not that much, but you know, if you're doing it regularly, you'll start seeing over time that your knives will start to get ever so slightly smaller, ever so slightly narrower, and personally I think that's just a waste of a good tool. Lastly, on stones, before I forget, this is known as a puck. This is the Gransfors Brux one. I bought it when I bought one of my axes, and essentially you can use this by hand, take it in the field of view. It's nice and portable, and if that's your axe, that's the blade of your axe down here, you'll just very gently, in a circular motion, whilst covering your hand in dirt, I might add, you'll gently just kind of move along the axe like that to give it a sharpen, and this has got a coarse side and a fine side as well. So those are the sharpening options for your tools, and as I say, I don't use them very often. So what am I trying to suggest? Well, what I'm talking about are these. These are strops, and I don't mean you're getting in a mood and going have a paddy with someone. These are known as leather strops, and they are extremely good for maintaining your tools. If you're using a carving knife, even if you're using an axe for carving, I will generally move over to a strop every, I don't know, maybe half an hour or so. If I'm using a sort of a soft to medium hardness wood, might do it a bit more regularly if I'm using something really hard like oak. But essentially, one of these leather strops in combination with a honing compound, and this is Starkey Blue, otherwise known as Smurf Poo. A lot of people will be familiar with this, but you can use things like Jeweler's Rouge, which usually comes in a red. You can even use things like Auto Sol, which is used for sort of buffing car panels. Anything that's kind of known as a buffing compound you can generally use on one of these strops, and what it will do is the buffing compound, it's ever so slightly abrasive, nowhere near as much as these stones, but it does have an abrasive quality, and by giving a few passes of your knife after use, and I tend to do this every time I finish a carving session at the very least, what it will do is it will just help refine and bring that edge back to full sharpness. And these are really simple and easy to make. I mean, this one I think I bought, this one I think I made. It may be the other way around. In fact, I'm sure this was the one I made. But essentially, you just get a bit of A bit of relatively thick leather. Veg tan is brilliant. Vegetable tan leather is great. You know, I've seen people repurpose leather jackets, handbags, shoes, sofas that are being thrown out. You know, any type of leather will do at a pinch, but if you can get a good grade tanned leather that's kind of, you know, 3, 4, 5 mil thick, that tends to work really, really well. And you just need to make sure that you put it on a nice flat solid back, like a lump of wood like this. Put a bit of your honing compound on and away you go. Now, I didn't want this video to be massively long. I realise we're kind of hitting about the 8 or 9 minute mark. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut here. I'm just going to give you a quick demo on how to use a strop, and then I think we'll call it a wrap. Right, so I've just pulled out one of my old Morers. This is the beater that I tend to use in my workshop. As you can see, the tip got snapped off some time ago. Still perfectly good for carving, but I tend to just use this more as a general purpose knife. Now, here is my strop. It's got some Starkey blue on there. And the difference between using a strop and a stone is basically doing the opposite of each other. So if you imagine the back of this piece of wood was one of my sharpening stones, I would take my knife, I would lay it completely flat, and because it's a Scandi grind, I would roll it forward until the bevel meets the stone. And it's quite a positive stop. You can roll too far, but you really are just rolling it until the bevel meets here. And then all you're doing is pushing it forwards and pushing it slightly to the side at the same time, trying to use as much of the stone as possible. And then when you come back to go the other way, you start at the far end, you roll it until your bevel meets, and essentially what you're trying to do when sharpening is almost take off the very thinnest shaving, the very thinnest slice you can of the stone. And that is what will sharpen your knife and get it nice and sharp, ready for carving. Now, with a strop, you're doing the opposite, because obviously, because it's made of leather, if you were to try and push the blade of your knife forward, you're just going to cut into the leather because it's a very soft material. So what you want to do is start at the very back, and I always do the same thing. I start flat, roll back until I hit my bevel, and then you're pulling the blade towards you, or the back of the blade towards you, and running it down the strop. Now you'll see here, this area, as soon as I've done that, has started to darken. That is microscopic pieces of this metal being scraped off, for lack of a better term. You know, the abrasiveness of this honing compound is removing microscopic levels or microscopic layers of this metal and helping it to sharpen. And likewise, you start on the other end, you roll your bevel so you get it nice and in line, and then you just run the knife back as so. And you'll do that maybe 5 or 10 times per side, and if you've already sharpened it as well, what you'll find is that sharpening will create very small burrs. Most of them are microscopic along the edge of your blade, and then if you cut a piece of wood, you'll see kind of little marks in there that, you know, it's not a particularly clean cut. And by doing this, and I've been doing this for a long time, so I can kind of do it pretty much by eye. If you're new to it, as I say, lay down your knife, roll the bevel until you hit, until you get in line with the bevel, and then probably using both hands. Now this doesn't have any feet on it, so you kind of have to be a bit more careful, and you just pull your knife down. And that is what I will do with my carving tools every single time I use them. Now I might do it 2 or 3 times during a carving session. If I'm only carving for half an hour and it's a nice soft wood, I might just do it at the end. But that's how I personally, for the most part, maintain all of my carving tools and keep them nice and shaving sharp. Right then guys, well I hope that was useful. I hope it's given you something to think about, you know, just to kind of make sure that when you are carving, you keep your tools nice and sharp. You know, one of the biggest causes of injuries whilst carving is by trying to use a blunt knife or a semi-blunted knife, because you have to put more pressure on to try and you know, push it and cut it through the wood. By doing that, when you finally get through at the end, you generally get kind of a bit of a shock. You know, the blade kind of just jumps out through the end of the wood, and if you've got a finger or an appendage or a leg or something like that in the way, you're really going to hurt yourself. So make sure you keep your tools sharp. One last thing to mention, I was going to talk about oil. Now there are a lot of people that will tell you that there is only one type of oil to use to keep your blades protected. I don't buy into it. A lot of people swear by camellia oil. Some people will use kitchen oils. I tend to favour just a bog standard mineral oil, 3-in-1 multi-purpose oil, just because I normally have it hanging around. It's never done me any wrong. It's cheap as chips. And it really seems to work. Now I tend not to oil many of my tools. Most of mine live in the house with me because I've invested a fair amount of money in them. I don't want to leave them out in my workshop where potentially I can't see them, and God forbid it ever got broken into. That's quite a lot of tools to go in one sitting. But anything that does live out here, a few of the tools that you see up there on my wall, those I will give a general coating of this once in a blue moon. You just need to put a little bit on a rag or a tissue or your finger and just give it a very quick rub, very light layer, and it will just protect it from moisture and from rusting, because most carving tools tend to be carbon steel, which is prone to rust. So anyway, those are my tips for maintaining and sharpening your tools. Hope it was useful. Comments and questions in the box below. Hit like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I hope you'll all join me next time. Cheers, guys.